Did you miss me? I hope you missed me. I don't know. Did you miss me though? What are we doing here? So welcome to I Swear to Drunk I'm Not God. This is season 3, episode 1. Thank you so much for coming back. You did not have to come back, and you did because you love me. And that's so great. It's so cute. I'm just joking, but I thank you. I really do appreciate everybody for joining me again. I have some new listeners. I'm very grateful. I'm more than grateful, actually. Today, we're going to be talking about some crazy shit. And for the premiere of this season, we are going to make it a part 1 and a part 2. See, I told you I was going to come back and give you what you needed. Not that you need this at all, because it's per use, just pretty fucked up. But yeah, so we're gonna be talking about some foul shit. What do I have anything to update you on? Not really. I've been very busy. I've had a lot going on. This month has been very chaotic for me between work, family stuff, friendships, and trying to maintain a social life and like do all of that shit. So, and health wise, I've been kind of all over the place too, but I'm doing well. I really am doing well. Things are starting to kind of feel a little level, not particularly normal, but definitely level. So you're probably like, what are we talking about? Okay, cool. Fuck you. Fine. Oh, also, you're probably like, bitch, you don't have a guest? No, I don't. Nah, not today. Everybody's busy, man. Like, as you get later into the year too, it gets harder to kind of, pin people down. People got shit to do. People preparing for the last quarter of the year. You got holidays coming up back to back. People got family shit, relationship shit, all types of shit. People all over the place, right? Work shit. So I'm doing this by myself. Okay. And I know how much you all love having my sister on board and Dustin and Sal, and they will all be back. But this first episode, it is going to be moi. So you're going to have to just listen to my lovely melodious voice. You hear me? Okay. So what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about George Hodel and the Black Dahlia. Yep. You're probably like, fuck the Black Dahlia. Yeah, but the George Hodel part is probably the most interesting part. No disrespect to Black Dahlia, but of course, the George Hodel part, I fell into this. I stayed in this for a while. I read for this episode, the Black Dahlia Avenger, A Genius for Murder, The True Story by Steve Hodel. Steve Hodel is the former detective with the Los Angeles PD, and he's also the son of George Hodel, who was a key suspect in the infamous Black Dahlia murder case. After his retirement, Steve Hodel became an author and an investigator. He was focusing on the unsolved murder of Elizabeth Short. And in the Black Dahlia Avenger, his book, he presents his theory that his father was responsible for the murder and potentially other crimes as well. But we won't get into those, but we'll get into some of those, but we'll mostly get into the Black Dahlia. So Steve's investigation includes an analysis of the circumstantial evidence, of course, the family history, and the details from the police files. I teased George Hodel before on the Gene Spangler murder and on the last episode I did last season on Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. He just kept popping up in my brain. And when I was living in Georgia, I had actually listened to the podcast on this as well. So I'll link it so you can check it out. It's called Root of All Evil. It dives into the Hodel family and the granddaughter of George Hodel. It's very fucking interesting. I mean, when I listened to it, I could not stop thinking about it. I was like, okay, I don't see how this dude didn't do this. But we're definitely going to get into it a little deeper. Okay? Oh, okay, I fucked that up, but it's fine. Sip. Well, you don't even know what the fuck we sipping. Also, before I even tell you what we're sipping, this falls on Halloween, so happy fucking Halloween. And I know we got a 2-parter, so I will follow it up with the second episode for sure. But this is gonna be in depth. We're gonna have some deep ass conversations about this motherfucker. So for this episode, we're gonna be drinking the Black Dahlia. The Black Dahlia is a cocktail that consists of vodka, black currant, fresh lime juice, bitters, and then I added a little bit of simple syrup just to kind of give it a little zhuzh it up. It was a little too bitter for me. Your girl loves some flavor. just a little bit of flavor. It wasn't bad. It was just like, yeah, I don't know. You know? Like, I don't know. It was just one of those things. So, go out, get you some I'm starting already. Get you some black currant liqueur, some fresh lime juice, some bitters. I use Angostura, and some vodka and a little bit of simple syrup. Shake that shit up in a cocktail shaker with some ice. Strain it into a glass, and boom, you got you a Black Dahlia. And it is quite good. I'm not even gonna hold you. It's actually pretty good. Okay, so I'm not gonna waste too much time on the intro because we're in this shit. Okay, we are in it. Sip. Yeah. All right, we're gonna start from the beginning per usual. Now Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia, named posthumously after a film noir murder mystery called The Blue Dahlia. And according to the FBI official website, she received the first part of her name from the press for her, quote, rumored penchant for sheer black clothes. She was originally from Boston. She was born July 29th, 1924 to Phoebe May Sawyer and Cleo Short. She had 4 sisters. Now, Cleo was a Navy sailor, and by 1929, stock crash, of course, he found himself penniless after building a few mini golf courses and losing his entire savings. So, of course, just like any father does in 1930, his car was found on the Charleston Bridge, and it was like assumed that he jumped in the river, but nay. Phoebe received a letter from Cleo. He was so fucking alive. In 1930, Mr. Short would leave the family for Southern California, leaving his family and his wife and his kids in Medford, Massachusetts, which is a suburb outside of Boston. Now, Elizabeth would attend Medford High School, but she dropped out her second year. And in 1942, she moved to Miami, where she got a job as a waitress. There, she meets Major Matt Gordon Jr., a pilot. He went overseas, and Elizabeth had written over 27 letters to this man in 11 days. She had a particular fondness for men in uniform, specifically military men. She always wanted to be around them. Then in 1943, she traveled to Santa Barbara, California, where she worked at the post exchange for a military base. Now, she would eventually leave this job and go on the hunt to find her father, who lived in Vallejo, California, where he worked as at a naval shipyard. She found him and she stayed with him, but it wasn't as comfortable as she thought it would be. They didn't get along. She went back to Santa Barbara, and while there and her boyfriend overseas, she starts getting into the nightlife and the clubs, specifically the ones with military men. Then at 19, Elizabeth would be arrested for being in an establishment with alcohol because she was underage. And this was a violation, of course, of California's liquor law. She agreed to return home in lieu of charges. So the county got her a ticket and she went back home to Medford. While in Medford, she continued her correspondence with Major Matt. And then in April 1945, he proposed. Now, Elizabeth accepted, but Major Matt was killed in a plane crash in India. After this, she retraced her steps. So she went back to Miami. She worked as a waitress, then went back home in 1946. And then finally, in April of 1946, she made it back to California. And this time it was in Hollywood. Now, while in Hollywood, she lived as a transient. She was bouncing around hotels and boarding houses between Long Beach and San Diego. And at one point, she lived in an apartment in Hollywood with 7 other girls. Then, on January 9th, 1947, Elizabeth left the lobby of the Biltmore Hotel. 6 days later, she would show up dead. Now, Elizabeth had been frantically waiting at the Biltmore hours before her disappearance. According to Steve Hodel, she was pacing and awaiting a phone call for hours before she finally left the lobby. Now, who was she meeting? Who was she waiting for? Was this the person who took her life? So we're going to talk about it. On January 15th, 1947, a woman named Betsy Bersinger, who we find this out later, was walking her daughter in Leimert Park in LA and discovered the mutilated remains of what looked to be a woman lying in a vacant lot. A lot characterized by police as a lover's lane. She was actually only a few inches from the sidewalk. The woman went back home and phoned the police. Now, the woman didn't leave her name, and the office also didn't ask for it. The officer did take her number, but then he lost it. A patrol unit would eventually show up under the auspices of a 390, which would be considered a stuporous drunk, not knowing that they were going to discover the remains of a young woman. Now, at that time, reporters would listen in on the police scanners for a story. When Will Fowler, an LA Examiner reporter, arrived, he was not looking at a drunk. He would later write about it in his book, Reporters, Memoirs of a Young Newspaperman. Quote, "There she is," I said. "It's a body, all right. There's something about a dead body you couldn't mistake. I approached it like I half expected it to jump up and run after me. As I got closer, I called back to Pago, who was pulling his speed graphic from the car trunk. Jesus, Felix, this woman's cut in half. It's difficult to describe two parts of a body as being one. However, both halves were facing upward. Her arms were extended above her head. Her translucent blue eyes were only half open, so I closed her eyelids." End quote. Now, when the police finally arrived, they noticed that the dark-haired woman was definitely cut in half. She was cut in half at the thoracic vertebrae, neatly cut. Even though there was a bunch of photographers at the scene, the police asked that they not release the photos. Quote, "Carefully examining the photographs, the two separated halves lie in close proximity, although the upper torso appears to have been placed asymmetrically, approximately 12 inches above the lower portion and offset to the left by approximately 6 inches. Both of the victim's arms are raised above the head, the right arm at a 45-degree angle away from the body, then bent at the elbow to form a 90-degree angle. The left arm extends at a similar angle away from the body and then bends again to form a second 90-degree angle that parallels the body. This was no normal dumping of a victim to get rid of the corpse quickly. In fact, the body had been carefully posed just 6 inches from the sidewalk at a location where the victim was certain to be discovered to create a shocking scene." End quote. Now, when Jane Doe number 1 was finally examined, they determined that the cause of death was hemorrhage and shock from a concussion of the brain and lacerations of her face. The trauma to the head and the face were the result of multiple blows using a blunt instrument. Her body had been neatly dissected with an instrument similar to a surgeon's scalpel, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that a skilled professional, a doctor, had killed this woman. They determined that she had been killed 24 hours before on January 14th after 10 a.m. Next task was to figure out who she was. The LA Examiner put out a description. Then they released her fingerprints to the D.C. Bureau of the FBI, and they confirmed an hour later that the two fingerprints were that of Elizabeth Short, who submitted her fingerprints when she applied for her job at the Post Exchange, and in 1943 when she had been arrested. Now, the autopsy report was beyond gruesome. She was beaten and bound by her hands and feet. She was cut all over her body, as well as her nether regions. Her pubic hairs were cut, and her pubic hairs were inserted into her vagina. She was forced to eat her own or the killer's feces. She had pieces of flesh removed from her body and inserted inside of her vagina. Her mouth was sliced from ear to ear. Her breasts were lacerated. She was cut in half at the waist just below her umbilicus. The incision was consistent with the incision made during a hysterectomy. She was drained of blood, and her hair and skin were washed as there were fibers of the brush used found on her body. Quote, "These actions, unique in their execution, clearly demonstrated an intellectual familiarity with the philosophies and practices of a classical sadist. These were ritualistic, systematic, specifically defined, and volitional acts of torture, all of which indicate the pure focus of a highly sophisticated, skilled, and practicing sadist. End quote. Now, what else did they find at the scene? Well, they found blood splatter. Although the body was exsanguinated, there was blood found on a cement bag, and it looked like the blood had been diluted with water. One detective believed that it was used to carry both halves of her body. There was a military wristwatch discovered. It was a, quote, 17 jewel croton with a leather-bound steel snap band. Engraved on it are the words Swiss-made, waterproof, brevet, stainless steel back. Footprints were found. Investigators noted some bloody footprints near the body, but they were not definitive enough to identify a suspect. But it seemed to be a man's shoe. There were some tire tracks on the edge of the curb, which suggested a vehicle may have been involved in transporting the body. During the investigation, it was discovered that a resident saw a 1936 or 1937 Ford sedan, black in color, pull up to where the body was found. Witnesses were making statements of their last sights of Elizabeth Short. One of the girls she was sharing a room with stated that a man came into the bar they worked in and said his name was Clement, and that he wanted to talk to the bartender about Elizabeth Short. He was denied. There was even an officer that said that Elizabeth Short ran up to her days prior crying in terror. There was also a press release that 5 unidentified youths told the police that she had planned to marry, quote, George, an Army pilot from Texas. They also interviewed another former roommate, Ann Toth, who said she was friendly with several men while she stayed at the house on Carlos Avenue with me. I remember 3 of the men. One was an Air Force officer from Texas, another a radio announcer named Maurice, and the third was a language teacher. He was about 35 years old, 5'6", medium build. He drove a black Ford or Chevrolet. I remember he had promised to set Betty up in an apartment in Beverly Hills if she left our place on Carlos. End quote. Now, they interviewed hotel managers as well and said that she registered with a man for a room under Mr. and Mrs. Barnes on the 12th, and that the man was acting bizarre. Mr. and Mrs. William Johnson, who managed the hotel, were key witnesses. The police never revealed that to the public. On January 23rd, a call was received by the LA Examiner's city editor. Acting time. I'm going to sip. Is this the city editor? Yes. What is your name, please? Richardson. Well, Mr. Richardson, I must congratulate you on what the Examiner has done in the Black Dahlia case. Thank you. You seem to have run out of material. That's right. Maybe I can be of some assistance? There was something in the way he said it. He said it sent a shiver up my spine. We need it. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll send you some things she had with her when she, shall we say, disappeared, which is like, okay, motherfucker. It was difficult for me to control my voice. I began scribbling on a sheet of paper the words, "Trace the call." What kind of things? I asked as I tossed the paper to my assistant on the desk. Oh, say her address book, her birth certificate, and like a few other things she had in her bag. When will I get them? Oh, within the next day or so. See how far you can get with them. And now I must say goodbye. You may be tracing this call. Wait a minute. Click. Then, of course, because of course, they start receiving letters from an individual calling themselves the Black Dahlia Avenger. In 2 weeks, they received 13 notes taunting the press. The first was the caller making good on their promise to present items from the Black Dahlia. A package arrived with an address book, her birth certificate, her ID, and a social security card. The notes kept coming, saying things like, "To Los Angeles Herald Express, I will give up Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." The address book didn't belong to Short, but to Ann Toth's boyfriend, who was part owner of a club called the Florentine Gardens. He rented Elizabeth Short a room and believed that Elizabeth Short stole his address book, likely for his celebrity contacts. He added that he was aware that Elizabeth had dated many different men while she was living there, including a language teacher, I know, and many other persons, mostly hoodlums, whom I wouldn't even let into my house. Even after all of the early leads, by February 1st, the case was cold, but they sure did sell a fuck ton of papers. They sold a shit ton of papers. Because at the end of the day, these sorts of cases are so fucking sensational. You know, there are so many things that they can speculate from something like this. You got a 22-year-old girl who is found in a park cut in half. If it bleeds, it fucking leads, right? You can do whatever you want to do with that story. You can plant all sorts of seeds. Then on top of that, you got all of these different people. You find out this girl is kind of, a little bit of a free spirit. She dates a lot of guys. She does this, she does that. And then on top of that, you get these letters. This motherfucker is now calling himself the Black Dahlia Avenger. And not only is he taunting the press, but he also actually was able to supply pieces of evidence that are truly connected to her. An address book, her birth certificate, an ID, and a social fucking security card. What we dealing with here? Now let's fast forward. I'm going to sit. We're going to fast forward 52 years, actually. We're going to fast forward to 1999. Steve Hodel visits San Francisco to assist his stepmother, June, after the passing of his father, George Hodel Jr. And when Steve arrived, he expected to do the normal funeral stuff, but his father had requested to not have any of that. To whom it may concern, I do not wish to have funeral services of any kind. There is to be no meeting or speeches or music and gravestone or tablet. I direct that my physical remains be cremated and that my ashes be scattered over the ocean. There are several crematories in San Francisco which provide these services. If I die in a foreign country, cremation and scattering of my ashes may be carried out in that country, or the ashes may be shipped to San Francisco for disposition with the choice to be made by my wife, June, or if she is unavailable, as the executor of my will shall decide. George Hodel, dated June 16, 1993. Stephen notified his 7 living siblings. Hodel had 10 children from 4 different women. He didn't have any friends. There wouldn't be any funeral. The death certificate had his cause of death being congestive heart failure due to ischemic cardiomyopathy. He also didn't have much wealth. Even though he always lived well, George had less than $1 million. He left small inheritances to his children, and the rest was left to June. With not much left to do, it was time to get to know who the fuck his father was. Steve and George didn't really form a relationship until George was much, much older. They had a very almost business-like relationship for years with like these check-in sessions here and there. There was definitely an emotional disconnect between George and his children. But the awkwardness is that all of his children still idolized him. Quote, "Where dad was rock, I was water. My father was clinical, almost bloodless in his dealings with people. If he was intuitive, it was so far below the surface, you wouldn't even know it was there. He was a hard and cold individual with a huge ego whose demeanor bordered on tyrannical. King George, friends called him in jest, but it was true." End of the quote. Now, while talking to his dad's widow, he can tell that she was holding back. She wasn't sharing who his father really was. She would know She had been married to him for 54 years. And even though he wouldn't verbally share, she did share Hodel's private photo album. Now, Steve would find within it pictures of the family, photos taken by an artist named Man Ray, and shockingly, pictures of scantily clad women, including Steve Hodel's ex-wife, Keo. We will get to that later. And another woman that bore a shocking resemblance to Elizabeth Short. Now, who the fuck was George Hodel? Right before leaving San Francisco and saying his final goodbyes by taking George's ashes to the sea, June handed Steve a note. She said, "They are his notes to me. Last October, he believed his heart was about to quit and he prepared these notes. They were for a talk he was going to have with me, but never did because his health improved. I found them in his desk. Some I understand, others I do not. You're a good detective. Maybe you can help me decipher them. It is important that I know everything he wanted to say to me." Steve, a private investigator and retired LAPD homicide detective, was curious now more than ever. Why was this woman who bore a strange resemblance to the Black Dahlia in his dad's private photo album? Steve started his own investigation and proceeded to track her movements by going back as far as he could to connect her to the murderer. Even though he was no longer a detective, he now needed to know how his father was connected to this woman. George Hodel Jr. was born October 10th, 1907, to George Hodel Sr. and Esther Leof. George Sr. was a very successful physician from Odessa, Ukraine. He met Esther Leof in Paris, where she was a dentist, and they married. They eventually came through Ellis Island and they made it to California. Now, George Hodel was an only child. He was very intelligent. He was actually a musical prodigy. He had a genius IQ of 186. He went to South Pasadena High School, where he graduated at 14. He then enrolled in Caltech at 14 to be a chemical fucking engineer. He dropped out after 1 year. Quote, "There were two versions of the story of his expulsion. In the first, he left college because he had a sexual liaison with a faculty member's wife, who became pregnant as a result and was divorced by her husband. In the second version, he was kicked out for playing poker because gambling was prohibited on campus. In any event, by the time he was 17, he had left engineering school and was working at a variety of jobs. He got his first job as a crime reporter for the LA Record during the Prohibition years, where he saw firsthand raids of nightclubs and speakeasies. At 16, he wrote, "Outside the brilliantly lit Hummingbird Cafe on 1243 East 12th Street, officers are waiting, watch in hand, ready to swoop down on the place. On the stroke of 12 Saturday night, all possible exits are guarded. All avenues of escape are watched. They are determined that this raid could not fail, that they should clean up the wettest hole on Central Avenue." That is a weird fucking sentence. I'm a goddamn child, but when I see the wettest hole, I get distracted. I know what you mean, but makes me feel funny. He would then move on from reporting and becoming a publisher in 1924. This is at fucking 17, by the way. George would publish a magazine called Fantasia. Now, George slowly but surely developed an interest in dark sexual and violent fantasies and would review a book titled The Kingdom of Evil by Ben Heck. My father's review of The Kingdom of Evil, in which he's completely absorbed in Heck's belief system, is the most accurate picture of his psychology. He writes in part, macabre forms more dank and putrescently phantasmal than any of Heck's former imagining, grope blindly and crazedly in the poisonous fog out of which loom the rotting fancies that people his Kingdom of Evil. Kingdom of Evil by Ben Heck is a dark and philosophical novella originally published in 1924. The story explores themes of corruption, moral decay, the human capacity for evil. It centers on a journalist who encounters an enigmatic man referred to as the master, who espouses a worldview dominated by selfishness, manipulation, and cruelty. The master believes that true power comes from embracing the darker sides of human nature and actively works to corrupt those around him. Through their interactions, the journalist is drawn into the master's twisted philosophy, which paints the world as a kingdom ruled by evil. The story reflects Heck's sharp critique of society and human nature, with a strong emphasis on moral struggles people face when confronted by their own darker instincts. Now, after George's magazine published his publishing attempt, he went off to become a cab driver. He lied and said he was 21 to get his chauffeur's license. And by the end of 1925, George got another job as a radio announcer. And this is like the most fucking ambitious 20-year-old I've ever seen in my life. It's one of the moments where you're like, wow, I've done nothing in my life. Not just that you enrolled into Caltech to study fucking chemical engineering at 14, but then only to drop out and become a fucking journalist at 17. Then also publish your own fucking magazine, then to move on to review shit, and then I'm gonna drop all this shit and become a cab driver. Like, what? Huh? So then in 1927, George would date Amelia and open a rare bookshop. So let's just sprinkle a little entrepreneurship on them. This motherfucker's on the move. He opened a rare bookshop in downtown LA. Now, they would go on dates with a lot of people, specifically couples. They do a lot of double dating, and they used to double date with Dorothy Harvey and John Huston. Now, if you don't know who John Huston is the father of Angelica Houston. Angelica Houston actually plays Morticia in the Addams Families from the 90s, and I will be her for Halloween. But John Huston, he was the legendary American filmmaker who directed my favorite fucking Humphrey Bogart movie, The Maltese Falcon, in 1941. He did The Treasure of Sierra Madre in 48. He did The African Queen in 51. I fuck with Maltese Falcon. I'm not even gonna lie. Like, if Maltese Falcon is on, I'm watching it. That is not a movie I'm turning from. So then by the summer of 1927, Amelia would get pregnant and she would have Duncan in 1928. Now they moved to San Francisco, where George enrolled in UFC at Berkeley. They had a pre-med program there that he enrolled in because, yeah, why not? Just become a doctor. Fuck it. You've done everything else by the time you were 10. Just become a fucking doctor. So at this point, he's still a cab driver. He got a job as a longshoreman eventually. And then by 1932, he was back to writing, and this time for the San Francisco Chronicle, where he wrote with Amelia. So they wrote a weekly travel column about San Francisco, which I actually think is really adorable. By 1932, George graduated from Berkeley and enrolled in medical school. Then he requested something a little more unorthodox. He wanted to share his room. He wanted to share his home with Amelia and another woman, Dorothy Anthony. Dorothy Anthony would eventually get pregnant in 1935 with Tamar. Now, in 1936, George would go ahead and graduate from medical school and take his Hippocratic oath and do his residency in surgery. And he wasn't even 30. Just in case you were wondering. Then he became a health officer at the New Mexico Department of Public Health. He picked up Amelia and Duncan and moved to Arizona. He was the only doctor at a logging camp and then became a health officer at a Native American reservation. Now, Amelia and Duncan would eventually leave to go back to San Francisco, and she would marry another man. So then Dorothy and Tamar would take their place. They would also eventually leave for San Francisco. They would leave San Francisco. Then George would move back to LA, taking a position as a hygiene physician. He did this like post grad as a venereal disease specialist. He was promoted in 1939 to the head of the division at the LA County Health Department and handled venereal disease control. He also had his own practice, the First Street Medical Clinic, that he operated privately to treat venereal disease. Now, while in LA, George would reunite with Dorothy Harvey. There's two Dorothys, just so we're clear. There's Dorothy Anthony and there's Dorothy Harvey. Dorothy Anthony is the mother of his child, Tamar. Dorothy Harvey is the girl that he used to date, to go on double dates with John Huston. He called her Dorero. Excuse me. That came out of nowhere. I had to belch. Sorry. He called her Dorero. And Dorero means gift / so Dor means gift. Eros means god of sexual desire. So where do you think this is going? So Dorero had since married John Huston. She had been married to John Huston. So Dorothy Jean Harvey was born in New York on Central Park West on April 15th, 1906. Around 1913, her family moved out to Riverside, California, where they bought an orange grove not far from Los Angeles. Later, they relocated to LA, where Dorothy went to high school. Now, while she was there in her teens, she met and fell in love with John Huston. Then in 1925, the two of them, both teenagers, ran off to New York. They got married and then they settled in Greenwich Village. And after a while, they returned to Los Angeles, where they both started writing screenplays for Hollywood studios. They married, their marriage, lasted 7 years until 1933, when Huston filed for divorce, citing Dorero as, quote, being extravagant and keeping him in debt continually. He also accuses her of making no effort to become a good housekeeper. Like, God damn. He was like, this bitch taking all my money and she don't know how to clean shit. It ain't worth it. Now, George and Dorothy started seeing each other and had a child named Michael. And you're probably like, damn, that's kind of fucked up. He fucked his friend's ex-wife. Nah, it's not. I talked to my therapist about this because I've probably done this a few times myself. It's not a rule. It's not a rule. Just, I'm going to sip on that. It would be the courteous thing to do, but it's not a rule. It may be morally reprehensive, maybe a little ethically fucked up, but it's not illegal. So if I'm with somebody and I decide that I want to date their friend, that's my prerogative. I'm just saying, I talked to my therapist about it. She was like, no, it's shit that people make up. It's not a thing. And to be quite frank, if my relationship ends with you and it didn't end well, what the fuck do you care if I start dating your friend? I may have done that once, twice, maybe thrice. I may have done it a few times. There's no shame. I have no shame in that. So I just feel like I need to go ahead and put that out on the table. If you want to log off and like stop fucking with me, feel free. But at that point, your ex-boyfriend's friends are just like a matter of convenience. And if he ain't even friends with them no more, then who the fuck cares? Anywho, so now George and Dorero, they started seeing each other. They had a child named Michael, even though it was rumored that Michael was John Huston's son. Dorothy would go ahead and she would get George to marry her. Shortly after, she had Michael, a set of twins, Steve and John. John died at birth. And 11 months later, she had Kelvin. By 1942, George wanted to join active duty, but his heart was bad. He had failed his physical. And during this time, his marriage isn't going well. Dorero was a fucking drunk and George was never home. They were married for about 4 years before separating and getting a divorce in 1944, citing extreme cruelty. Dorero, Steve's mom, who is the writer of the book, was a fucking mess. She was always drunk and she kept a revolving door of men. For 2 years, 1944 to 1946, Dorero neglected her children and even lost custody of them at some point. There's an interesting story where Dorero is actually fucked up. Steve catches her having sex with someone, and Steve, in an effort to rescue his mom, who's being what he thinks is being attacked when she was being fucked, the guy is like, this is what, slaps him or like pushes him or some shit, and it's like, your mom's a whore, and like goes through a whole fucking thing because they were both like totally drunk. And it ended up being a mess. Then there was another interesting story where like Dorero sends her kids to a hotel to meet up with John Huston, because of course George is gone and he left the kids again. And to get money from John Huston, she sends her kids to this hotel and tells them to go pick up the money and then get back in the cab, and they come back. I was like, this is so ghetto. Like, if we are keeping it a smooth buck, this is ghetto as fuck. Now, in the meantime, George is ladder climbing. By 1945, George was hired as a chief regional medical officer for China by the UNRAA. The UNRAA is the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. They were an international organization established in 1943 during the World War II to provide aid and relief to areas liberated from Axis powers. And during the time that Dorero was neglecting the kids, George was in DC, and then that was before, leaving for China. This man is never done. His job was to diagnose the communist prisoners, and if they were sick, they passed through the nationalist lines safely. If not, they remained with their captors. In a report filed, he summarized his feelings about the venereal disease issue in China. Quote, for 9 years as health officer and an administrator of an official venereal disease control program, I have observed the workings of regulation and of repression. It is my opinion that prostitution is an evil which cannot be caused to cease by legislative or police action, but which can only be deflected into other channels. I have learned, however, from my American experience, that for corrupt policemen to chase loose women from one end of town to another contributes neither to the peace, health, nor morals of a community. Then in 1946, George resigned, and Steve, the author, believes that this was due to George's health and that he had a heart attack, possibly due to hepatitis, before being sent to LA for hospitalization. Now, back home, George was flaunting his like military fit, like feeling all confident because he did his little stint in China. His new title was supposed to be getting him bitches because George is a major fucking philanderer and womanizer. And after leaving China, George had become obsessed with Asian culture, buying up as many Oriental works of art for his new house. The new house was the Lloyd Wright Soden House, also known as the Jaws House, due to its striking facade resembling the mouth of a shark with jagged teeth. It is a historic home located in Los Feliz, which I love Los Feliz. Oh my God. It was designed by architect Lloyd Wright, the son of architect Frank Lloyd Wright, in 1926. The house is a prime example of Mayan revival architecture. It features dramatic texture, concrete blockwork, bold geometric patterns, and almost fortress-like appearance. The Hodels called it the Franklin House. Steve tells a very interesting story that happened at the Franklin House. So Steve and his sister Tamar is like sitting, and Tamar is like having a cigarette, which she's a child. She's not supposed to be having a cigarette, but she is. She offers Steve a puff, and he starts smoking a cigarette. And then George walks past, he sees Tamar and Steve smoking a cigarette, and he doesn't say anything. Now they're thinking they're going to get in trouble. And so he basically speaks to them and then like leaves. And they're kind of like, oh shit, we almost got caught. Did he see us smoking? I'm not totally sure. Like that's the kind of the energy. So then later that night when they're about to go have dinner, George decides to announce at the table, he's like, hey, so apparently Steve likes, he smokes. Steve's like, oh shit, okay. This is fucked up. So do you know what motherfucking George does? Okay. George takes out a cigar. He takes out a cigar. He takes the cigar, clips the end, lights it, pulls in on it, drags, then hands it to Steve and tells him to smoke the entire fucking cigar. Yes, that is what you heard. And he got pissed because the whole time he was like, fuck, what is happening? Why is he making me smoke this whole cigar at this table like this? And so, of course, Steve's kind of like, yummy. And George got fucking pissed. He got fucking pissed. He's like, this dude's an asshole. He got fucking pissed. And so anyway, I just thought that was a very interesting story. Now, from 1945 to 1949, Hodel and his wife Durero threw these parties at Franklin House. Yeah. The Franklin House had become in those days almost like a salon where artists, flouting convention and social mores gathered around my father who had the means to entertain them. On the guest list was an artist by the name of Man Ray. George and Man Ray had a close, complex relationship that was deeply rooted in the world of surrealist art. Both men were part of the avant-garde Los Angeles art scene in the 1940s. Hodel admired Ray's work and seemed to share his fascination with surrealism, which was a movement that explored themes of the grotesque and dreams and the unconscious mind. And Man Ray, who was born Emanuel Radnitsky, on August 27th, 1890 in Philadelphia, he became famous for his work in photography, painting, and filmmaking, and he became a significant role in the Dada and Surrealist movements. Man Ray's family was of Russian Jewish descent, and they later moved to Brooklyn, New York. Early in his career, he changed his name from Emanuel Radnitsky to Man Ray to avoid the anti-Semitic discrimination. He moved to Paris in 1921, where he became deeply involved in the Surrealist and Dadaist art circles alongside figures like Marcel Duchamp and Salvador Dali. And there was someone else Ray was interested in. His name was Marquis de Sade. Now, you heard me talk about this man before. Quote, crime is the soul of lust. What would be pleasure if it were not accompanied by crime? It is not the object of debauchery that excites us, rather than the idea of evil. Marquis de Sade. Marquis de Sade was a French nobleman. He was a writer and philosopher best known for his controversial works that combined philosophy with themes of sexual violence, cruelty, and eroticism. And I actually talked about him in the Toy Box Killer episode I did with Sal when I had addressed my very uncomfortable and shocking viewing of 120 Days Sodom adaptation called Salo. It was very hard to watch. His writings were so fucking notorious that they were because they were so explicit and they explored such extreme violent sexual themes, plus like just sexual freedom in general, that his name became the root of the term. And that's where we get sadism. So sadism, referring to deriving pleasure from inflicting pain. Marquis de Sade's life was filled with scandal and imprisonment due to his libertine lifestyle, and various accusations of sexual assault, debauchery, and blasphemy. He spent much of his life either incarcerated or in exile, including in the Bastille and later in insane asylums. I mean, he had been placed in an insane asylum in 1801 by Napoleon Bonaparte because of his erotic literature, specifically a piece called Justine and Juliet, and that is where he died in 1814 at 74. Now, George was inspired by Marquis de Sade. I mean, he was like, I kind of like what he's into. You know what I mean? He's like, I kind of fuck with it. And Man Ray did too. Both George and Man Ray are both Francophiles as well. And don't take that wrong. Francophile is basically somebody who has a deep appreciation for French culture, language, and history. I'm kind of a Francophile. But during Man Ray's 2 decades in Paris, he had studied all of Marquis de Sade's writing and he cited him as one of the world's freest thinkers. Now, I respect free thought, but I do acknowledge, I had a conversation about this with Sal yesterday. I do acknowledge that there are limits. Because me and Sal are kind of the same way in this regard. Like, don't get me wrong. There are things that we are just like firm, fuck no, stubborn, right? But there are other things where I'm like, as long as it ain't legal, like I'm not going to knock you for, exploring your sexuality or engaging in activities that are a little on the fringe. I will say this was my issue with Diddy. It's funny. I went back and I was listening to, I think it was the Gene Spangler episode, and I had teased George Hodel, and I had said, George Hodel is basically Diddy, right? And what I was saying when I was saying that is that there's this, this sexual exploration that I feel like certain people like me, I always joke and say that I'm a hedonist and I really appreciate debauchery. Yes, I do, but it has its limits. Right? Like, I'm not wild and crazy out here just like Jordan Belfort, Wolf of Wall Street going ham, but I do appreciate when other people have the desire to do that. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are times where I want to get down, where I'm outside. I want to party. I want to come home at 5 a.m. I want to be pissy, not literally, but you know what I mean? I want to be intoxicated. I want to, I want to listen to some music. I want to dance. I want to wear cute clothes. You know what I mean? Like, there are those times where you want that. Then there are those times where you want to be sexually free, where you want to explore different things within reason. As long as there is consent and there are no children involved, to me, do whatever the fuck you want to do. I don't, and dogs and animals and shit. Like, don't fuck with no animals, don't fuck with no kids, and don't fuck with people who are drugged. Like, that's Diddy's problem, right? Like, I never had an issue with the fact that Diddy had sex parties. I don't have an issue with the sex parties. I don't have an issue with that. What I take issue with is when you start drugging people and when you start using the activities that they engaged in at your home, thinking that you can use it as leverage against them later. To me, that's where you fucking lost me. Like, there's a way to like have a good time and then explore everybody and have these, free thought and sexual freedom without going to jail. That's just my opinion. I'm gonna just leave it there. Now, quote, Man Ray worshipped what he believed was Sade's complete freedom from convention, from the morals society imposes, and even from the constraints of literary tastes. It is believed that while in Paris in the early 1920s, Man Ray was asked to photograph for preservation purposes a rare original handwritten manuscript by Sade entitled The 120 Days of Sodom, which had been discovered in the French government's archives at the turn of the century, which, just like I said, yeah, that is, I can't explain that movie enough. I can't. I explained it on a Toy Box episode, and every time, like, that is one fucking Salo, Salo, is one of those movies that will forever be trapped in my head, and not in not in totality, because there are a lot of parts that I'm pretty sure I blocked out, which was also very interesting about the Black Dahlia, them discovering her body. This detail I didn't know was that they found fecal matter in her mouth. That part I didn't know. And that smacks of 120 Days of Sodom, because in 120 Days of Sodom, and I did mention this in the Toy Box Killer, there is a scene where one of the generals squats, takes a shit, and makes the girl eat it with like silverware. Which I don't know what's worse, picking up a turd and eating it, or slicing into a turd and then eating it with a fork. Like, I don't even fucking know. Pretty disgusting. But I would feel like the delicate dissection of a turd with a knife and fork and then insert it in your mouth like it's a fucking filet mignon is fucking disgusting. I'm sorry. Anyway, I had to deal with it, I didn't have to deal with it. I could have turned it off. But there was a part of it that it was such a fucking train wreck. And so if you're interested, and mind you, this book is still sitting in my Apple Books. I did download 120 Days of Sodom because I wanted to compare, because I'm sick, but two, because I wanted to compare the narrative structure of the adaptation to what Marquis de Sade had actually written. And what I didn't know until I was really exploring Marquis de Sade was this idea of evil. Again, I do understand that people engage in debauchery and that people have fetishes and things that they like. There are some people who find it very sexually gratifying and pleasurable to be shit on and to be peed on. And to me, again, everybody grown, that's your business. I don't got to clean that shit up. That's your business, right? But I didn't particularly think about like what he said when he said it is not the object of debauchery that excites us rather than the idea of evil. I'm excited by debauchery. I'm not excited by evil. It is never my intent in any of the pleasure-seeking activities that I engage in to harm anyone. Like I've always been that person who's like, if you're into it, cool. If you're not, don't do it. Like, I'm not going to sit up here and like make everybody like I used to have these parties where like, it was a joke, but my mom got really mad at me because I said this at a party one time where the one rule of the party was that everybody had to basically be crawling out of the fucking, and not like literally, but that's how drunk I wanted you to be. But let's say hypothetically somebody, and mind you, I was in my 20s, so extend some grace. But just imagine like if there was somebody who was a teetotaler at my party and was like, actually, Britt, I really don't drink like that. I was just coming over to kick it with y'all. Woo, woo, woo. I wouldn't force them to drink. You know what I mean? Like I wouldn't start spiking shit to make them drink. Like that idea of evil is the part to me that's just like not exciting. But there are people who enjoy the fear, who are obsessed with the prospect of somebody being terrified by something that they did. And I'm just not that type of person. So I'm not condoning that. And obviously in any capacity, like I firmly am into this concept of debauchery and having like, I joke and I'm like, oh, hedonist, like let's just all go buck wild, let's go fucking crazy. But at the same time, like negative, not if it means that we're going to be doing fucked up shit to people. Absolutely not. That's not fun to me because I'm not an evil fucking person. So there's that. Moving on. Now, Man Ray was indeed a sadist, and he never tried to hide it. He believed that women only exist for man's pleasure, and to enhance that pleasure, you had to add pain, humiliation, and degradation. And you're probably like, well, how did they meet? Steve wasn't really sure, but when he was referring to George and Dorero and Man Ray and Juliet, who was Man Ray's wife, Steve said they were all sensualists. Their own likes and strong desires must have drawn them as moths to the same single flame of passion. To father, life itself was surreal, a dream in which each man made up and lived by his own rules and within his own world. Like the sinister Aleister Crowley's black magician from the turn of the 20th century, my father conducted his life according to the dictum, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Man Ray had been so close to the family that he had taken family portraits of them, and he also took several nudes of Tamar. Yeah, George's daughter. Now, I know you're like, okay, George is a fucking weirdo. His friends are weirdos. Where does the crime pick back up? Literally right now. Right now, it's about to get worse. Now, as we know, by the late 1940s, Hodel is a fucking polygamist. I mean, he was living with Dorero. He had Dorothy Anthony and Amelia. At some point, everybody was like living in the same fucking house. Tamar, his daughter. He had 3 children, which was Michael, Steve, and Kelvin. And then he had Duncan, who was grown. Now, Duncan would pop in and out. I explained that the Black Dahlia was killed in 1947, but it wasn't until October 1st, 1949, when a connection was made to Black Dahlia and George. Tamar ran away on October 1st, 1949. George searched for her privately and finally ended up calling the police. And when she was found 2 days later, she was at a friend's house. LAPD had asked her, like, why did you run away? And she said, because my home life is too depressing. They asked her why. She said, because of all those sex parties at the Franklin house. She admitted that she didn't just see the parties. She was involved in them. She told the authorities about her father and her father's friend, Fred Sexton, as well as 2 other women. Now, Fred Sexton was an American artist. He was a sculptor. He was best known for creating the iconic Maltese Falcon prop used in the film. And Sexton was a friend of the filmmaker, John Huston, who directed the Maltese Falcon. He was commissioned by Huston to design and craft the statuette that would play the central role in the movie. And so Tamar, she was detained by the police and George was arrested 5 days later. Tamar, 14, by the way, admitted that her father had been sexually assaulting her since she was 11. Now, apparently, and this is by no fucking means an excuse, but apparently Tamar was incredibly stunning at a very young age, and they actually said she looked like a young Marilyn Monroe. So needless to say, Tamar was very promiscuous at a very young age, and likely due to a lot of the sexual assaulting going on, right? Now, George's response, quote, "These things must have happened." He then asked to talk to a psychiatrist, and Tamar would be interviewed again, where she mentioned getting an abortion in Beverly Hills in 1949, which was a month before she ran away. Now, this was a real life soap opera scandal. George was arrested. The doctor that performed the abortion was arrested. The other perpetrators involved were arrested. Oh, and also fellow students she was forced to orally copulate was fucking arrested. She told on George and 19 other people. Yep. So he goes to trial. He made the statement like, "I was just delving into the mysteries of love and the universe." And then he said some shit like, "It was unclear. It was like a dream. I can't figure out whether someone is hypnotizing me or I am hypnotizing someone." Quote, Tamar, questioned by prosecutor William Ritzie on direct examination, testified that on the evening of July 1st, 1949, she returned home from a date. She changed her clothes and went into her father's bedroom wearing a green smock, blue jeans, gold slipper, and a brassiere. Present in her father's bedroom was her father, his friend Fred Sexton, and 2 adult women, Barbara Sherman, age 22, and Corinne Tarrant, age 27. Tamar drank a tumbler full of sherry, and then Fred Sexton undressed her and committed an act of oral copulation. She testified that her father then performed both oral sex and an act of intercourse, and was followed by Barbara Sherman, who orally copulated with her. Here's the kicker. The defense asked Tamar on cross-examination, quote, "Tamar, do you recall a conversation where you had with a roommate at the Franklin house by the name of Joe Barrett? And do you recall in that conversation making the following statement to him? This house has secret passages. My father is the murderer of the Black Dahlia. My father is going to kill me and all of the rest of the members of this household because he has a lust for blood. He is insane." Tamar's response, "I don't remember saying that to Joe." The prosecutors brought on witnesses after witnesses, including one of the women present, currant, who testified that she was there and saw Tamar kiss Sexton, but she didn't participate. She also said that this happened in George's presence, which is like great dad, fantastic father. And they watched Sexton undress Tamar, orally copulate her, and then have sex with her. George eventually pulled Sexton off of her and kicked him out of the room, but then Hodel performed cunnilingus on Tamar and had sex with her. Currant claimed to have walked out of the room at that point. Sexton was called in and attempted, but didn't succeed. Then the other woman in the room, Barbara Sherman, was called but refused to testify. She was then threatened by the prosecution because she had already under sworn testimony stated that she witnessed the acts performed on Tamar by her father and Sexton. The only real way to combat an allegation is to discredit the accuser. So it was now the defense's job to prove that Tamar was a liar. They called 14 witnesses, including Tamar's own grandmother, her mother, and brother Duncan. Then George testified and said he was, quote, demonstrating hypnosis to the 4 adults in his bedroom. Barbara Sherman was the subject, and Sexton and currant watched as he ordered Sherman to raise her hand, suggesting to her that they were bars of steel. He told the jury that when he turned to the others to have them note the experiment, he saw that Taryn's arms were likewise extended, and then he saw his daughter and Sexton sprawled on the bed. He claimed that Tamar had her blouse and brassiere off and Sexton was fully clothed. He immediately pulled Sexton off of her and ordered him out of the bedroom. After Sexton left, he ordered Taryn out of the bedroom, who is currant, and sent Tamar to her room. He related to the jury that Tamar was mistaken on her dates and that the hypnosis session was not July 1st, but rather June 18th. The same night she had come down from San Francisco to live at the house. He informed the jurors how he had asked her mother, Dorothy Anthony, not to send her down because he had recently suffered a heart attack and was in no position to give his daughter the close supervision that she needed. He concluded his testimony by informing the jury that Tamar's account was nonsense and was the fantasy of a vengeful and incorrigible child. Surely you know how this will go. The defense pegged Tamar a psychological liar and an accomplice in her own rape who deserves to be locked away. The witnesses, Currant and Sexton, were pegged as accomplices as well, but were not arrested. Why? Likely because they were not in the right minds when they testified, especially considering they probably made deals with the police in exchange for not being charged. George was acquitted. After hours of deliberation on December 24th, 1949, George got the fuck out of Dodge and moved to Hawaii, leaving his family, selling the Franklin house, and getting remarried. They were on their own. Steve would admit that his mother was just George's plaything. He treated her like a pimp would treat his women. He used her for her bisexuality and her hedonism. He abused her emotionally and probably in many other ways. He knew she had a substance abuse problem, a drinking problem, and that she was a sex addict, and he only needed her for his entertainment. After George left, they were on their own. By the late 1950s, Steve watched his mother drink herself into fucking oblivion and even started to join her. They bonded over alcohol. He watched her engage with strange men. One day, they got into a heated argument where Dorero told her son that you don't know your father. Your father is a monster. He is a terrible man. He's done terrible things. Your father pretends to be a doctor and a healer, and he's really insane. If you really knew the truth, you'd hate your father. So you're like, bitch, where does the Black Dahlia fit in? I couldn't get into Steve's discoveries without giving you context. I mean, Steve Hodel's investigation of his own father was painstakingly detailed. According to Steve, George was a suspect right after the Tamar trial. Steve needed to talk to Tamar. She was 66 years old when she finally told Steve more about the relationship with George. She said, quote, "The only time I ever slept with George was on that one occasion. I thought that it was going to be this big, romantic, wonderful thing because he promised that when I was 16, I would get to be a woman and he would make love to me. In the meantime, he was just training me for oral sex and stuff like that. George said he was going to send me away to an unwed mother's home. The fact that I was going to be sent away was horrible to me. I was scared to death. My girlfriend Sonia told me, oh, you have to have an abortion. I didn't even know what an abortion was. Then I talked to a few friends my age, and they all said, you have to have an abortion. So I went back to George and I put the pressure on him, told him, I have to have an abortion. He arranged it. It was horrible. They didn't give me any anesthetic. Nothing. In the middle of it, I was screaming, stop, but you can't stop in the middle. It was awful. The worst physical experience of my life. I was throwing up and in shock. This very strange man who was a friend of Dad's drove me back to the house on Franklin. Now, what was also interesting was when Tamar was 11, she recalled her mother sending her a doll. She took it to George and asked if he could pick a name for her. He said, Elizabeth Ann. And he kind of laughed like it was a joke. Years later, she told a friend that that same story. And her friend showed her a magazine with a woman, that same name, Elizabeth Ann Short. She said, oh my God, I never knew that was her name. I just heard it was the Black Dahlia. That's the end of part 1. Please don't hate me. Please don't hate me. We got so much to get into after this, y'all. We got so much to get into after this. It's going to get juicy. It's going to get really, really juicy. I hope you're probably going to wait to listen to both of these parts, but which I always recommend. That's not a news flash, but I wanted to chop this because we're only halfway through. There's more to talk about. So I hope that you all remember this if you listen to it, because I'm going to drop this on Halloween, and then I'm not going to drop the second part until the following week. So I highly recommend listening to both at the same time, or you can listen to this one, and then when I drop the second one, you can re-listen to this one. You see what I'm saying? You see what I'm saying? So, yeah, we'll talk. And, what is my point? I hope you all enjoyed, I hope you enjoyed the Black Dahlia, which feels weird, but I was actually talking about the cocktail. I hope you enjoyed that cocktail because it's really fucking delicious when you add simple syrup to it. And I want you all to know that I really did miss you. I know. I talked about making my episodes a little shorter this season too. I have some episodes that I was listening to, and I know that sometimes people have to break them up. I'm going to try to keep my episodes in like the hour and a half range, maybe even a little less like this one is going to be. I don't want to inundate people with too much, especially when it's a lot of characters. And this one has a lot of characters between George, Steve, Keo, Tamar, his siblings, the 3 women that George was married to, the fucking, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of people. So I'm gonna, even though I try to be thorough, I am gonna start trying to keep my episodes under an hour and a half. Okay. I don't want to scare people away from my podcast when they look at the counter and they're like, wait a minute, this episode's 3 fucking hours long, you know? So I'm going to work on that this season for you. And anytime I feel like I'm going to get over 2 hours or over an hour and a half, I'm just going to make a part 1 and part 2. Is that okay? Especially if I feel like I'm only halfway through, like this one. You know, if I find myself with an episode and I'm like, well, it's an hour and 20 minutes, but I only got 2 pages left, you just going to have to ride that shit out. You know, most of y'all listen to me when you fucking working and shit anyway, and riding trucks and shit like that. So I think most people who like listen to the audio prefer longer episodes. But we'll see. You know, I always tell you I'm gonna do some shit and then I do the exact opposite. You know, that's just how I roll. So thank you for coming back. I really, really appreciate every last one of you. I'm looking at the numbers. People are listening to my shit every single day. And I'm so grateful that I didn't waste my time doing this shit, you know, because, oh, that would hurt. That would really hurt. If you want to follow me on TikTok, feel free. Sting Like a Bee. That's BEA as in B Arthur, not the B, but BEA. If you want to follow me on Instagram, my podcast is Swear to Drunk Podcast, or you can follow me personally at Lavender and Bordeaux. I don't do Facebook. I don't do Twitter or X or whatever. Fuck that dude. I don't do, the other one, Threads. I don't do any of those. So if you want to catch me, you're better off catching me on TikTok. That's where I spend most of my time. Cool. All right, cool. I love y'all. I appreciate you. And I can't wait to see you all for the next part. Cool. All right. Bye.